Let's go ahead and take a look at sample variance, standard deviation, and population variance and standard deviation. I want to make sure you understand the difference between the two and then how we do that on StatCrunch. So the problems are related to problem 3.25 from section 3.2. It's also the first three questions from your online homework, 3.2.7 from the textbook, and 3.2.14 from the textbook. But those are the first three online. And so the first thing that you need to recall is what is the difference between those two. And so when we started lesson 3.2, we were talking about measures of dispersion. And so we have multiple ways to measure how spread out data is. I even introduced it through kind of a dinner example of ages at a dinner party and so forth. But in this case, we have these different measures, right? One of them is the population standard deviation. And again, we're using StatCrunch. It's a complicated formula. You can see a lot of hand calculations would be involved. And again, it's measuring how spread out the data is. And specifically, it's looking at how far from average, on average, are each of the data values from the average of the data set. So you can imagine what that is. But you go through the lesson to kind of go through that. But again, a population means that you're collected the data from everyone in the population. That's different than if you calculated, if you take a sample, right, and do a sample standard deviation. The formulas are identical, except you have this one here. It's been adjusted, divided by n-1 here for the sample. And that means you're taking data from a bigger group. And when you do that, we need to adjust because we don't have all of the data. So there's some adjustment there. Again, this is the formula for, that's the formula for population standard deviation. Notice we're dividing by n, the total population size. So those are the difference. You're taking a sample versus a population. And then variance is another way of getting down there. Variance is another way of measuring. There we go. The variance is just the square of the standard deviation, and we end up using, it's just another way, like a mean, median, and mode is a measure of center. This is just another way of measuring how spread out data is, and we call it the variance. We end up using this in a few in more advanced topics later in the course, and so there's an advantage with the variance when you square it, right? It's the square of the standard deviation. That's all the value is. So if the standard deviation is 5, the variance is 25. And again, it goes with population sample. Go with, did you collect the data from all of the population or just from the sample? And the reason some people prefer the variance, because it's the squared part, is if you get back to the formula for standard deviation, right? When you get back to the formula, it involves a square root. So mathematicians, statisticians don't like square roots, so they square it in terms of having to do calculations. But there's more to that. And so now how are you going to solve those problems? Here you can see here you have this button here, open the data in StatCrunch. Here we're looking for sample standard deviation variance. Just open StatCrunch there. And then summary stats, and then in the columns, and then variable 1. And then there it is. You have the variance, and then you have the standard deviation, and then that's how you would calculate it. Hit compute, of course, and there you have your answers there. So that's how you would do that. And so that's how you would get your answers there. On the next one, it's asking for population variance and standard deviation. So what you would do there is open in StatCrunch, and then summary stats, columns, there's variable 1. But in this case, we would use the unadjusted variance and standard deviation since we're dividing by the full population. We didn't adjust it. In the sample, we divided by n-1 if you're going to do it by hand. And so for population, we call that unadjusted on StatCrunch. And so then you would just compute that there. And then, oops, I got to select the columns. And then once you have that there, you get your population variance and standard deviation there. That's what you would do there. And so that's where the answers would come from. You don't have to do it by hand. And then question 3, looking at range and sample standard deviation. Again, just open it here. and then you realize you have summary statistics. Range you can do by hand, it's just max minus min, but you can still use that there. And then you can see there's a range option there. And I think we needed sample standard deviation, so you would just go standard deviation there and build there. So there's where you would get your answers from.